Hello and welcome to the Divine Renovation podcast, where we seek to inspire and equip you to bring your parish from maintenance to mission. My name's Dan O'Rourke, and today we have an amazing episode, and we're going to have Chris Lowney joining us. And he's an author of Everyone Leads. He's an amazing speaker. I'll hold it back. I'm holding it in, and instead I'm going to throw it over and introduce the couple guys that are with me, including Father James Mallon. Good to see you.
Hey, Dan. Good to be back.
It's great. And also Rob McDowell. It's also a pleasure to be with you today, buddy.
It's great to be back, Dan.
Now, Father James, you're back from some travel, and one of the places you were was actually not too far from here in Halifax. You found yourself in Montreal, Canada.
That's right. A simple 1-hour flight. It was really short.
Isn't it? Yeah. That's actually my favorite flight that I ever get to take is the Montreal flight because it's super quick.
Yeah, it was a great trip. Got to experience my first snowfall of the year in Montreal.
Nice.
Which was very interesting, but it was great that actually this decision to go to Montreal was made almost 3 years ago when Father Michael Leclerc came to Halifax to do a priest internship with us, as a 6-month internship. And part of that agreement was if Michael came, then I would speak.
2.5 years later, you'd go to see.
Well, it was supposed to be last year. They canceled the event. They moved it or something like that.
Okay.
But it was a long time in the works, but it was well worth it.
And Father Michael, just so people know who he is, he was a guy who came here. He's a priest who came here for an internship. How long was he here in Halifax?
He did a 6-month internship experience, and he was our. If you don't count Father Simon, he was our first intern in that kind of way who came in, and he had a phenomenal experience with us. And when I was in Montreal, I got to spend time with them. I got to meet their leadership team, their staff. I preached at his parish over the weekend, and I was able to witness a panel discussion of Michael and his senior leadership team during the conference that I was speaking at.
Now, before he came here, I want to put this in time. Before he came here, did he have a senior leadership team?
No, he didn't have anything like that. No,
but he was a pastor though.
He was a parish priest. Father Michael, basically one of the things I heard a lot when I was there were parishioners and brother priests saying to him, when you came back from Halifax, you were a different man. You had changed. And he in his own words, he came back from here not only with a sense of what could be possible and what can be possible, but spiritually he was renewed as well. And the one thing that I'll say that I really witnessed in his parish was that they're executing on all the principles that we speak on. They've put evangelization at the heart of what they do. They're running Alpha. Lives are being transformed. They're leaning into leadership and all the principles that we speak about. But the one thing that stood out for me is that there's God is at work here. Like there's something happening in that parish that cannot be explained. I mean, it should be like that in every church, shouldn't it? I mean, that seems so strange to say that this is such an exception, but it's very tangible. For instance, the final mass on the weekend, there was about 450 people, and I have to say it's probably the youngest Catholic congregation I've ever seen anywhere.
What?
Probably average age of early 40s. This is in Montreal.
In Montreal.
I mean, Canada is a very secular country. Quebec is a very secular province. Montreal is a very secular city in that province, in that country. So it's quite remarkable what is happening there.
I think, when I think back when Father Mike was with us too, one of the things that we keep pushing back is, what people sometimes refer to as the trait theory of leadership, is the idea that a good leader is a certain personality type.
Yep.
And you're very gifted in a lot of areas in what you do. And so often people are like, well, I'm not Father James. I don't have a St. Benedict parish. I don't like God just all of a sudden ordained all this stuff in your life, to make it happen. Right. And I don't know as if there's anyone, I mean, Father Michael is always very gifted, but I don't know anyone that's probably any more of an opposite personality than you are.
And there was a key moment in the conference, because I gave a talk on the Saturday morning, and then they had Father Michael and his leadership team up on the stage, and a couple of people from the diocese were asking questions. And what was so wonderful about what happened was not just what they said or how they said it, but everything about it. They communicated the values of teamwork. And one of the things that Michael said was, I'm very different than Father James. I mean, we are very, very different, but it's that principle. If no one has all the gifts, I like to say that by myself, I'm a bit of a train wreck. Not a bit, a lot of a train wreck. Because by myself, if I'm not pulled back, I drive things until they all blow up, and everyone I usually my leadership in the past always came with a high body count, and so the reason why my ministry has been so fruitful is precisely because I came to grips with the fact that I may have these gifts, but there's a whole bunch of gifts that I don't have. And that's the same for every person. And what they're witnessing or what they're living in such a beautiful way is that sense of teamwork. And Michael has an amazing team, is an incredible group of people who have come around him, and God seems to be bringing people into that parish. Here's the other thing too. People have gotten on board with it because he's cast a vision. Yeah. He returned to Montreal with a vision burning in his heart, and he communicated that vision, and people said, okay, I want to be part of this. Yeah. And so people and resources have come his way, and he's building staff teams, and it's incredible what they've done in 2 years. Amazing.
That's so exciting. So, Father James, I want to ask you a little bit about something else, because you got me thinking a bit. And just, I think, Rob, you said something about leading up. And your role is interesting with the diocese, because you've got your role, Episcopal Vicar of Parish Renewal and Leadership Support. Can we put that on your lower third?
Is one of the parishioners that St. Benedict says, Episcopal Vicar of something.
Of something.
I like that title.
So your own leadership style must continue to evolve, and because you find yourself evolving in different circumstances. Help me understand what that looks like.
Yeah, it's a bit like being an associate pastor again. I may have a particular vision or idea, and it's really about influencing the person in leadership, whether that be the bishop and his team, whether that be here at this ministry. Because the curious thing is that right now I'm not, the principal leader in any of the ministries that I'm involved in, which I'm quite enjoying that. It is, so but all of the ministries that we're in are all team based, so there's a share in that leadership. But it is quite different. Sometimes there's a give and take. You can't. It might not go through the way that it would if I was in the principal role of leading.
So let me ask you this question, because I know a lot of people who would be listening. Yes, we have a lot of pastors or parish priests that listen, but we'd also have a lot of lay leaders and other people, senior leadership team members. Now you've got an interesting perspective, because you've been for a while now. You've been in this role of not being the pastor at St. Benedict Parish, and so help me understand, what kind of advice might you give to people who are in those roles, who have a leadership, both a desire and a drive? How would you coach them or advise them as they look to express their leadership in those positions?
First of all, I think the person who's in that leadership role, the first challenge is that you have to love and support that person. You've got to be in relationship with that person. So it's not that you're constantly criticizing or finding fault, but you really come alongside and love that person. And then in a sense you have the right to kind of speak into difficult situations and to give advice. So you also get to kind of live out the values and principles that we desire to see in the overall organization within your specific area of influence as well. So I think sometimes we can be very critical, especially if things aren't going as quickly as we'd like to see them, or in the way that we would like to see them. But I think that having the foundation of a healthy relationship is primary.
The good thing is, at least in the ministry side, we move pretty quickly. So you're probably really relaxed there in that regard.
Well, it's funny sitting here thinking, because through the different scenarios, because I was on the senior leadership team when you were the pastor. Now I'm here, and there are projects and things that I report to you on. I still don't know who my boss is here, but there are times when I report to you, and the nature of the relationship and how you communicate to different people around different things and different values. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to try and think in terms of how you do lead up. Having spent the majority of my career not leading necessarily organizations, but being in leadership positions and having to influence the people above you and what that looks like. It's interesting, the different personalities, different values, and what that looks like.
So, Rob, you said something to me this morning that got me thinking. We didn't have a chance to dig into it, but you were talking about the difference between leading out of the flesh and leading out of the spirit. Could you share with me what was on your mind?
Yeah, I consider myself a bit of a student of leadership and love learning about it. And there seems to be this tension in the church so often, and it tends to be this all or nothing of how we grow as leaders, right? And today we've got amazing amount of books on leadership and studies and research and things like that. And so often in the church, you'll hear people say, "Oh, we shouldn't bring any of that modern thinking into the church, or we shouldn't bring any of that secular thinking into the church, or we shouldn't bring," you're right. And
it's a load of BS. People say a load of business stuff.
Yeah, and so but I was just kind of processing this week because, like I think there is a place where we can just put our hope in the latest management theory, the latest idea, the latest research study, whatever that looks like. But so I'm wrestling with the idea: what does it look like to still lead from a place of the Spirit, but allow that stuff to influence you? Because I think you can lead all from that and not have any sense of the Spirit's guiding, and the fact that the nature of our leadership should be different than a secular world, but yet at the same time understanding is there truth in that? Is there stuff that we can learn from that can be helpful for us and not lead us, but influence us from that standpoint?
I think sometimes in the church there's a temptation to over-spiritualize, as if the answer to the present challenges is simply to pray more. No, I think that's a good strategy. It's a good starting point. But St. Augustine said, "Pray as if everything depends on God, and work as if everything depends on you." So it's not enough just to pray more. And we also remember that our Christian anthropology states that grace builds on nature. So it's not even nature and grace. It's grace builds on nature. It doesn't replace it. It perfects it. And so just as we can learn from any other discipline like psychology or sociology, the discipline of leadership and all of the learning that's out there is totally applicable. And so I think I would say there's more of a bias today in the church in many places against learning from secular sources in this area. I think that theology that some people put forward, it unmasks perhaps a fear, because when you start admitting that leadership is something that you can learn and grow in, that makes you accountable. It's just like people don't want to measure things. They don't want, we don't want to set goals. We don't want to create a strategic plan because it holds us accountable to something. And so it's much easier to just spiritualize and say, "Oh, it's all mysterious. It's all invisible. It's all God's ways or not our ways," and which is all true, but it's incarnated in our present reality.
Well, what I found funny around this topic one time, I was driving to a conference with someone that was a pastor of a church, and it was interesting. On the drive there, he said, "We've just driven the Spirit out of the church today. We care more about marketing and advertising and promotion and all that sort of stuff." And he kind of went on his rant. It was funny. It was one day conference. We were driving back that same day. Driving back, it was interesting. The conversations went in a completely different way. But it was funny. He said, "Yeah, we really need to update our website. Like our website does not give a great first impression." And it was funny how he didn't connect those two parts of the conversation to where on one side he thought marketing and promotion was a bad thing, and then on the other conversation he wanted to update his website so that he could give a better first impression to people that came to his website, right? And he didn't connect those two thoughts, right? Well, is it wrong and sinful to have a good website and want to make a good first impression with people?
I guess I'm going to cut us off here because I think we've been talking about some really interesting topics, but I know the person that we're bringing on would actually be an amazing voice to have part of these conversations. So we'll take a brief break and we'll be right back. Welcome to the show, Chris Lowney. It is such a pleasure to have you with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the chance.
Now, where are you joining us from today, Chris?
From the beautiful Bronx.
Oh, wonderful.
A part of the Bronx called Riverdale, right along the Hudson River here. So I'm sure some of your folks remember Sully Sullenberger, who planted that plane in the Hudson River, came right outside my window. If I'd been sitting here looking for a plane to go by, I could have seen it.
That's awesome. So, Chris, I'm so excited to have you on. We're so excited to have you on the show. Not just me. All three of us are excited to spend some time with you today. But you're the author of a number of books, one of which I know is one of Father James Mallon's favorite books. I just think of it as Everyone Leads. That's sort of the way we talk about it around these parts. But it's a great book, and it's part of a number of books you've written. But, Chris, Help me understand who you are, some of your journey.
The short version of my life is I grew up in Queens, near the airports there in New York. I went to a high school of the Jesuits and was a Jesuit for a few years, a seminarian after high school. That was kind of the end of the era when folks often entered after high school. Now that's not that common. And after I discerned that my vocation in life was not as a priest, I did what anybody would do after leaving seminary, go to work at the investment bank of JP Morgan. And I ended up working at Morgan for about 17 years, and I was lucky enough to be a managing director in Japan and Singapore, London, and New York. So I saw different kinds of things in life. And I left Morgan about 2001, and since then I've been writing and doing leadership talks and often serving on boards of charities, often Catholic charities, but not also always. And, most of what I've written has been in one way or another trying to take principles that might be spiritual principles, Christian values, Catholic values, and write things for folks who might be leading families, leading businesses, leading corporations. And the book that we're mostly going to talk about is in a way exactly the flip side of that. It's the only thing I've written that kind of invites folks in churches and Christian communities and Catholic life to think about what we all might learn from the world of business and popular culture, and how folks are managing to be successful in all kinds of walks of life.
So Chris, what fascinates me is this transition you had between Jesuit seminarian experience and then into the private sector at JP Morgan. Help me understand what that was like, and what were you able to draw from your experience as in your formation into the private sector? What was it like?
That's your polite Canadian way of saying, how the heck is it that you went from a help others profession to a help yourself profession, I guess.
Maybe something like that.
So, a lot of times when folks are curious about that kind of thing, what is somewhere way in the back of their mind is, investment banking is filled with crooks, and, this guy was in a seminary and now he's with all these bandits. And, I have to tell you quite honestly, my experience was a little bit the opposite. I worked with very principled folks for the most part. And in a way, the thing that most made me reflect on was that I was almost always the most ethically educated person in the room. The one who had been in a seminary, studied philosophy, so on. But rarely would I be able to call myself the most morally courageous person in the room. The one who said, no, we shouldn't do that. That kind of thing. And, it kind of makes me think, and in a way, maybe it's an invitation for all of us to think as Christians, Catholics, there's a difference between I know what's the right thing to do, and I'm brave enough to do the right thing in the different situations life brings me. So that aspect of it was not the jarring in the way folks might assume. What was difficult for me, which may or may not be relevant to some folks watching with us, is the socioeconomic side of it. I grew up kind of on the streets in Queens, and at that time, JP Morgan was a real waspy place, kind of the American version of nobility, and it took a while for me to believe that I had value to contribute there. And, I suppose we could extract a spiritual a reflection out of that as well, that whether we're in a family, sitting in a church, in a big company, we believe that we're gifted people and that we should be using our gifts. And sometimes the big obstacle to folks using their gifts well is just their willingness and ability to believe, yes, I have gifts and talents, and however I understand that word, I've been called to contribute, and I'm gifted, and therefore I go and I'm able to use my gifts to their utmost. So that's my 2 cents on what that transition was like.
Father James, something Chris is saying is reminding me of what you said earlier in this episode when you talked about the BS stuff, the business stuff, BS. And so, there's this distinction that we sometimes make between the business world and the spiritual world or the faith world. And what I love about Chris's personal story, his personal journey, is that he crosses those very, very intentionally. But could you speak to how divided are those two things, the business and world and the spirit?
Well, I think this is the whole call of baptism. Remember, the call of the baptized is to be in the world, not to go work for churches. I mean, some lay people do, but the mission of the baptized is to be in the world and to influence the world to build up the kingdom of God. And so, if our starting point is that the world is totally corrupt and totally bad, I think we're going to miss not only opportunities, but we're going to miss what the Lord is already doing in that place. And whether it's these people in the business world who are leading in a courageous way. I mean, whether they believe in God or not, the God is somehow at work in their lives in that place.
Yeah, and I think alongside of that too is I think we can sit down and think through. Okay, well, I need to be careful about this decision because does God want me to do something vocationally, professionally? And then if not, okay, well then it doesn't matter and I can do whatever I want and because God won't really care. God cares about the decision, whether we're, serving him full time or not, but after that, it doesn't matter. Right. And I think we can downplay our roles regardless of how high profile or low profile they may be.
So Chris, one of the things I find interesting about your story, you spent time at JP Morgan, and then somehow you ended up writing all sorts of books, including one that has had an impact. It's had an impact on us here at Divine Renovation, but it's had an impact far beyond that. Everyone Leads. What's that transition like? I mean, from that investment banking experience to finding yourself writing a book that's actually having an impact on the Catholic Church.
So as we said, I worked at JP Morgan about 17 years, and I always had a deal with myself, I guess, that at a certain point I would think about moving on to a next chapter in life, and that was for all kinds of reasons. Probably if I thought I was going to be chairman of JP Morgan in 5 years, I would have stuck around a little longer. So part of it is calculus, but a big part of it is how do you feel good about your life at the end of the day? And there's nothing wrong with working in a big company at all, and I believe that companies run well in the world make a contribution to building up society in an important way, but I never kind of sat there and felt like, okay, I'm making a contribution the same way as a nurse or a teacher or something like that. So, to me, an issue was if I'm 70 years old and this is the only thing I've done with my life, I don't think I'm going to feel very good. So that was always somewhere in mind. And the first thing I wrote, Heroic Leadership, probably has done best of the things I've written, in a way took lessons from the early Jesuits and kind of translated it into a language that I was thinking of folks who worked with me at JP Morgan. Muslim, Christian, Jew, atheist, some Catholic, Christian. Could I kind of translate values that for Jesuits or for a lot of us would have very deep religious roots into a language that would be meaningful to folks in, whatever is their belief system. And, I thought that maybe in a way that was a cheaper way of figuring out my own life than going into therapy, having been a Jesuit and then working in a bank. But anyway, I thought it'd be fun to do. So I wrote that and it did fairly well. And, life kind of took its course. I didn't have a master plan for my life. I enjoyed writing.
Can I slow you down there? Because I think there's, you're going so fast through it, but I think there's something fascinating in what you just shared is that you took the ancient knowledge, if you will, and I know ancient's not the right word because it's not that long ago, but you took older knowledge, older experiences from your Jesuit training and you're able to convert it into language that would rest with a broader audience. And it's so much of what we write around business language or what's written about business language is often seen as being nouveau. It's seen as being fresh, but it seems to me though that you identified that, it's old wisdom that translates in. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think in a way, it relates to the one of the discussions you guys were having before I joined. And I mean, I guess I might put it this way, that I feel like there's we tend to have a kind of a split life disease a lot, religious people. Like, in other words, I go to church on Sunday and then I go to work on Monday. Those two things don't really have much to do with each other. And I guess I feel like they have everything to do with each other both ways, and, either the incarnation was like a kind of a sort of a make-believe metaphor, or it actually means something. I mean, the idea of being part of an incarnational faith, the fact that God actually was a human being, walked around, did something, met other people, that either means everything for us or means nothing, and so this idea of trying to understand how we work our way through the world, I feel like is what you're getting at. And yes, to come to the exact question you asked, I feel like there's a lot of great wisdom in our beliefs, our religious traditions, some of the charismas of the different religious orders, that's very relevant to, for example, being a successful organization, successful family, so on. Um, and likewise, I feel like some of the ways that organizations have discovered to be successful have a lot of relevance and interest and value to those of us who are trying to run churches. I'm on the board of a Catholic hospital system, to those of us who are trying to do that, and so on. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, the point is not, to me, well, is this an idea that some guy sitting at Air Canada or General Electric or JP Morgan came up with?
Right.
The idea is it a good idea? And importantly, our touchstones are our faith and the Gospels and our church, and is it consistent with our touchstone, our true north, our compass, this kind of thing, So, in the book we're going to chat about, I use some language that would not be churchy kind of language, but I try to make a point with every principle. If I can't relate this to Acts or the Gospels or so on, then we have to toss it out. So that's going to be our way of kind of proof testing. Yeah, this is something that is consistent with the way our tradition invites us to do things, and therefore it's okay for us to think about and maybe even learn from.
Now, Chris, when you started talking about that split personality, that double life, Father James, you started nodding, going, Did you want to touch on that at all? Because you were like, when Chris was talking about that.
I think it goes to the heart of mission, doesn't it? And I often struggle with the fact that for many Christians, it's almost like we've become almost Gnostics or Manichees, like Manichaeism. There was a sense that God would never infect himself by becoming human. The incarnation was the greatest scandal. And yet, the scripture tells us that Jesus pitched his tent amongst us. I mean, he took flesh. He didn't deem equality with God something to be grasped. He emptied himself. And the very manner, the missionary disposition of God and the mode of being missionary that the incarnation represents is exactly what the church is called to do. Jesus said, as the Father sent me, so I send you. And that means we've got to pitch our tent amongst the people in this world. And sometimes as believers, we can sit back and we can point, we can read the newspaper and point out how pathetic the world is. I mean, look at this world. It's so terrible and pathetic. Aren't those people pathetic? And we sometimes lose touch with the fact that, I'd be pretty pathetic too if the Lord wasn't at work in my life. And yet this is the world we're called to love and we're called to engage. And the Lord is already at work in some way, but that's the world that we're called to pitch our tent in. And sometimes in the church, there's this sense that the primary task is to protect the purity of the church. So let's retreat to an island and pull up the drawbridge and build high walls and keep everyone out. And it's the exact opposite of what we're called to be as a missionary church.
I think there's a lot of, my mind's going multiple different ways, but thinking in terms as well is because, again, we talk a lot about discipleship and we promote a lot of things from Alpha, Connect groups, all that sort of stuff. And I think we can sometimes carry that Sunday workday dichotomy that Chris referenced around the idea too of, okay, work is what I have to do to pay the bills. But when I grow spiritually, it's at my Connect group or Bible study and we don't see work as the lens of discipleship or the lens of mission. And, what would it look like? How could that change all of a sudden? That 40, 50, 60, depending on what people's work week is that's the context. That's one of the contexts that God is going to grow me up in. That's one of the contexts that God's going to use me in. That's one of the contexts that's highly intentional. It's not that this is just this sort of necessary thing to pay the bills so I can eat, so I can retreat to my Connect group or Bible study for a few hours each month. And that's where I grow.
That's right.
Yeah, I think, Chris, I'd love to get your thoughts on how this relates to culture and even what your perspective is on culture and how these two things interplay.
Yeah, culture in the church or culture at large?
Culture
Or
at
both?
large. Culture at
Yeah.
large. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, maybe culture at large first. I resonate with this discussion you're just having now, and I mean, maybe I would put it this way: that uh, Canada, United States, pretty secular business cultures right now. The idea that in a JP Morgan office, I would talk to somebody in a very explicit way about what I believe and why generally is not going to fly. But I think the way we might put the question to those of us who are working in those kind of environments is if somebody, maybe two ways. One, if somebody who didn't know your religious background found it out, would they say, "Oh, wow, I want some of what that person has,"
Hmm.
or now I get it. I see the way they operate. I see the way they coach and mentor people. I see what they stand for. I see what they're doing when they're not in work, and now I understand why they are who they are. So whether or not we're in a context where we can very explicitly talk about who we believe in and why, the behaviors should really be making some kind of a case, or else we're falling down. And also, I might say, we mention, you mentioned the idea of I go to work and that's how I get money when I then go off to my prayer group. And to me, I always thought at JP Morgan, it would be interesting if I could have, often we're sort of closeted in these big companies, and there's a lot of people wandering around who have the same beliefs you do, but you kind of never get to know.
Right. Yeah.
And I've sometimes thought a really helpful thing that the church world could. One of the points I write about is for the biggest network in the world on paper, the Catholic Church.
Yep.
We're incredibly poorly networked. I mean, it's pathetic, frankly.
Yep.
And among many, many ways we could be an effective network is to help Chris understand, oh, gee, Chris, did you happen to know that there are another 15 people working in JP Morgan who are very active believers also? And the point is not let's kind of make a little interest group, and fight and politically support each other in JP Morgan. That's in no way my point. Rather, maybe we would like to know each other and occasionally pray together and chew over some of the issues that we face. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which I feel like our network is very, very much under leveraged, both for the benefit of the church, but for the benefit of those who are working in the world.
Chris, can I just like to jump in and go bring the discussion back to the book, the first book of yours that I read that I really loved, and that's Everyone Leads, with the subtitle, How to Revitalize the Catholic Church. Obviously, the beginning premise is that there is a lack of vitality. I take it you're not content with the way things are. And I think if we're ever going to lead anything or influence anything, it begins with a healthy sense of discontent about the status quo. Tell us a little bit about your discontent.
So, first of all, what you say is totally right. I mean, as folks would probably gather from context, I'm a lifelong Catholic. I hope I'm devout. I'm certainly trying to be, and a great believer in what we can bring to the world. So now let's push that aside. The first draft of Everyone Leads, you're familiar with the book, and some others are. The way the book looks now, there's a chapter or so that talks about some of our challenges, which I describe as the church's greatest crisis in 5 centuries. And one of the things that's been disappointing to me in a weird way is nobody has chosen to argue with that. So people either say, yeah, we got a lot of problems, or they don't care enough to say, no, wait a minute, here's my counter case. In any case, that's about a chapter, and then there's a number of chapters that are a prescription of what we could do about it. And the first draft I wrote of the book, the problem stuff was almost half the book. Realized in a way, I wanted to punch somebody in the nose. I was kind of unhappy and angry. And, a question I had to ask myself is, well, what do you really want to do here? Are you trying to get something off your chest, or do you want to make a constructive contribution? And so the final draft of the book is much more about what we can do together and more hopeful. But now, having said that, I do think it's very important in this case to start with the problem, and that comes a little bit from my J.P. Morgan life. I'm a disciple of Jesus, but in corporate life was a bit of a disciple of a guy named Lou Gerstner, who helped to turn around IBM. And one of his comments that really made an impact on me was that I'm paraphrasing, but organizations won't change unless they feel a sense of real crisis and urgency, that their future is endangered. And I've found that to be very true, and I've worked in a lot of settings. And of course, the Catholic Church is a divine entity, but we're all human beings, and it's also a human institution, in terms of the worked out in the world. And therefore, the way human beings are has a great impact on our success or lack thereof in helping Jesus build his God's kingdom in the world. And it strikes me that for a lot of people, the predicate to change is only, look, I'm sorry, this is not going to work. And there are lots of different facts we could talk about. Among the things I talked about in the book are for example, the horrific lack of interest in the church and organized religion among young adults, youth. If you project forward a couple of generations, it's a beyond dire situation. When these cohorts age and the more faithful older cohorts age out, our incredible inability to attract folks to us. Pew in the United States does very interesting research across denominations of the number of converts in to converts out, so to speak. And right now in the United States, I don't know about other countries, in the United States, we're attracting one adult convert for every 6 who transfer to other religious denominations. And we could go on. So to me, there's a really dire set of circumstances. I think it's at great crisis proportions, and to me, that's the predicate to say to folks, look, a lot of us value deeply what we've gotten from this institution. It's been life-giving for a lot of us, and we care about it, and we don't want to see it, dwindle to insignificance in the lives of our grandchildren. And if that's true, then I'm sorry, you need to step up.
So, Chris,
we can't look around and say it's father's fault or this person's fault or that person's problem. That's not going to get it done.
So, Chris, you've spoken right into, I think, some of the key issues in your book and here, but you have hope, right? You have hope for what the future might hold as related to the church. Help me understand, what does that perspective look like?
Yeah, I have a lot of hope, actually, because you were chatting a little bit about the turnaround or vitality of a parish in Montreal that I think you were visiting recently, Father. And, you see in a lot of cases, it's not like you need St. Paul himself to show up. And, it's not like you need the Barack Obama of pastors. A lot of these things often boil down to blocking and tackling, to use an American phrase. In other words, if there are a number of steps that if you put them in place, not always, but often can generate results. And we have lots and lots and lots of examples of places where there are vitality, places that have turned around. So, to me, that's the most hopeful kind of story in the world. Now, having said that, to me, the big stumbling block is not we can't dream up any processes that will help. The big stumbling block is culture. And again, I go back to my organizational corporate life. One of the great mantras of organizational life is culture eats strategy for lunch.
Yeah.
In other words, you can mail somebody a copy of Divine Renovation, or some good-hearted priest, pastor, or some good-hearted parish council can have a couple of good process ideas. But if you don't have a culture of folks who are able to, in my language, lead, not going to work, And so for me, the hope is, there are lots of things you could do that will make things better. The challenge is, how do we change culture? How do we get enough of a critical mass of folks engaged in the right ways that they're going to want to do some of the things that we know work?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on there, and there was so much you said there. Go back to the discussion about Father Michael and his parish in Montreal. What I think brought me so much joy last weekend as I listened to them is that it really confirmed that this idea that you don't need to be a particular kind of personality or be in a particular place, but there are actual principles and values that if you actually live out these values instead of just talking about them, and if you engage certain principles, it will shift your parish in the right direction. It will move, and that movement may happen at a different pace from place to place, but it will move in the right direction. And that organizational shift is the number one task of parish renewal. Chris, you I'm sure dream about a particular local church, a parish, or the universal church, growing and being what it can be if everyone accepted the call of their baptism. And that was one of the things that really, for a long time, I had been, speaking to priests about, leadership is intrinsic to priesthood because we're ordained to be a prophet, priest, king. And then reading your book, it was like, oh man, I've been so dumb. Like, before we're ordained to be prophet, priest, and king, we're baptized to be prophet, priest, and king. The primary sacrament of leadership is not ordination, it's baptism. And it's a baptismal obligation to consciously accept the role that you have, the call that you have to influence the world. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. I couldn't add a thing to what you just said. To me, that would be the first stake in the ground. When I use the word leadership, and a lot of people tend to think about leadership only in a positional sense.
Yes.
No, that's why we have a pope, a bishop, a pastor. That's what leadership is. But the idea of there's also leadership in a behavioral sense. That doesn't primarily have to do with what's my role, rather how do I behave, and I'll talk about that in a second. But people's first hang-up is usually, no, wait a minute, this guy doesn't understand hierarchy in the Catholic Church and so on. And I feel like, no, I understand it very well. I understand that I was baptized, and this is what my catechism says it means. And if words like priest, prophet, and king don't imply leadership somehow, then once again, either our words are totally meaningless metaphorical jokes,
mm-hmm.
or they really have substance. The other way I talk about it is that, we use for us, I think, as Catholics, as Christians, leadership would be a kind of a paradoxical idea, maybe, because we use words like vocation, disciple, and the roots of those words somehow are following. Like if voco is call, if I call you, come to me, so you're following me. But our words also use words like apostle and mission.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the language roots of those words mean exactly the opposite. Missio is I send. So if I send you, you're not following anybody. You're out there. So there too, our call somehow involves followership, of course, of Jesus and our tradition in the church, but also apostleship, missio, sendness, leading. So to me, the only issue is, how now do we translate that to real life? How does that work its way out in the parish or the family or wherever we work? And, to use an organizational analogy, what I sometimes say is this, look, in my time at JP Morgan, our problems and challenges multiplied. The business became much more complex. There were many more customers that needed attention. Things changed too rapidly. And we quite clearly and came to an understanding that this very antiquated notion of leadership that like 4 people in a corner office, we're going to figure everything out, represent us everywhere we need to be represented, was total nonsense. And to me, that analogy is not every bit as true. It's more true in the life of our church, because our challenges also have multiplied. How do we figure out what to do with social media? How do we engage young people? How do we go after these folks who, used to come to church but no longer do? How do we attend to new migrants who come into, the challenges and opportunities have multiplied. But worse than secular places like JP Morgan, what we've traditionally thought of as those 4 people in the corner office, that cohort is shrinking rapidly. In other words, we tended to rely on the ordained clergy to be the team that would sort of show the leadership behaviors. And there's absolutely no way in the world that's going to cut it, given the array of challenges we face and the kinds of expertise that many of our ordained pastors do and don't have. That's not a statement of criticism to say that a guy who went to theology school might not necessarily understand how to use 3D social media. Why in the world would that person understand it? But somebody's got to know how to do it if we're going to thrive in the way that we all want to as a church in this century.
Chris, you referenced earlier the idea of, we kind of have this idea, I can't lead, I'm not a priest, or whatever the case is. So there's kind of that fundamental piece. What else is holding people back from stepping into leadership today in the Catholic Church?
Maybe at the highest level, I'd say call and opportunity. So to me, the first thing is that the Father James of the world, or the leaders of the parish council, whatever, have to stand up and say, okay, look, here's our reality. Or you look around the pews, you see our reality. There's nobody under 40 here. Or, the group is shrunk of people who are coming. Or we all know a friend who, came a long time ago and now no longer comes. So we all know our reality. And I need to call you guys into your baptismal promise to help us figure out how we are going to reverse this. So that's the first thing, call. And then, to me, along with that is, now how do we incarnate, so to speak, that in everybody's life? Because what folks are going to hear is, okay, fine, I get that. It looks like there's enough ushers and people to do the collection, and there are enough readers. They are going to think of the way the church runs now, or the way the parish runs now, and what might not have the intuitive imagination to understand, well, what the heck is a guy asking me to do? So the next thing is to kind of imagine what those opportunities might be. What are the leadership roles people could play? And of course, and people have all kinds of gifts. There's one kid who understands what kids will relate to, and maybe they're the ones who can help us say, this is how we reach out to young adults. And there's somebody else who, just is extroverted enough to walk up to people who seem to be new in the church and say hello to them. And there's somebody else who's willing to go through the list of people who are on the parish rolls who no longer show up and actually give them a call, and there's somebody else who's willing to lead a small prayer group, and so on and so on. So the first part of the problem to me is, yes, we articulate the call. And then the second part of the challenge is, now we're going to figure out how to tap folks' gifts and willingness and courage and so on.
So, Chris, your most recent book is called Make Today Matter, 10 Habits for a Better Life. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Remember, I said earlier on that most of what I've written has not been about the church explicitly, how we can improve our witness, but rather, about how folks, whatever their walk of life, might learn from the various spiritual traditions, especially my own Catholic tradition. And to me, often a big challenge of modern life is not so much that we don't know what kind of people we want to be, and they have some vague idea of what that means. But, modern life is so chaotic that I'm just floating along in this river of email, meeting, text, phone call, and I kind of lose track of who I want to be. And so Make Today Matter, in a way, it tries to reduce some of values and ideas that would be very, very deeply implanted for those of us who are Christians and Catholic, and express and turn them into habits that might help folks in a 24-hour by 24-hour, day by day basis to be who they would like to be.
So it's really focused on helping us as individuals to embrace those sort of patterns in life that can help us grow. I love that. That's so exciting. So Chris, if people want to learn more about you and your thoughts, obviously you've got a number of books out there, and we would be happy to see people buy them and to engage in your material. Are there other ways that they can find you?
So I'm pretty easy to find. I mean, I have the website I have, the author website is chrislowney.com. I'm always happy to hear from folks who want to interact on any of the ideas we've spoken about or anything else. The books I've written are pretty easily available on just by Googling my name on Amazon. There aren't that many Chris Lowneys in the world, so my books tend to come up, and I'm at Chris Lowney on Twitter. I'm perfectly happy if folks want to buy things I've written, but I also don't mind, and nobody's given me a plug or nobody's paying me to do this, to say I've always also really enjoyed Divine Renovation, and if they spend their first $10 buying a copy of Divine Renovation instead of my thing, that's okay too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so very much for being with us, Chris. It was a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
It was my pleasure.
And so if you've been able to join us and hung in throughout this episode, we look forward to seeing you again next week. And perhaps you'll feel inspired to share this podcast with someone you know, whether they're from your parish, perhaps your family or a friend, as we try and continue to expand the reach of this ministry and hopefully inspire and equip people to help move their parishes from maintenance to mission. Thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless.